introduce our budget committee. So we have Mayor Sticks, who is here, Treasurer Steve Olson, and it says appointed. We need to change that to elected treasurer officially, right? So we'll do that. But and then we have Mr. Jeff Rains and Mr. Johnny Johnston. So we have all present, and Pam Greer, our finance director, and myself are present as well. So with the committee, we will get started and move forward. We have 2 items on the agenda, so I would ask for a motion to approve the agenda.
I move the agenda be approved.
Thank you. And is there a second? Second. Thank you. And so for the vote, Treasurer Olson? Yes. Mayor Sticks? Yes. Mr. Jeff Rains? Yes. And Johnny Johnston?
Yes.
Thank you. So the agenda is approved. And then we'll get started with public comment. And so we do have 2 audience members. Do you have a public comment? Okay. Bob, go ahead. Guess I should have checked the cards.
Good morning. I'm sorry for the hoarse voice, but just got a froggy voice. I'm concerned about the budget and the finances. I've reviewed the June 14th of last year's city council meeting where we went over the budget. I'm concerned about some of our people's ability to do math. And Mr. Johnson, you and I have had a number of discussions over time on this. $5.9 million deficit in our employees' pension funds, where one of our council people recommended we put $100,000 a year to whittle away at a $5.9 million deficit. It's going to be 59 years. I'm not sure if they're mathematically challenged. I find that distasteful that we're not doing things to bring that up. And my mother told me a long time ago, just because Johnny jumped off the bridge, does that mean you should jump off? So the excuse I hear is, well, a lot of the cities are behind in the pension. We need to be more responsible. We need to do things that are a little bit better. The other thing is and I would ask the city manager to correct me. We've got about $60 million in deferred maintenance on our streets. We have a 15-year lifespan only. We have a 30-year paving cycle. For every 100 feet we go forward, we go back 200 feet. Our streets have taken a beating where they're a hazard. I'm having people with claims hitting potholes, breaking wheels, bending wheels, having problems with alignments. The first priority of this city is for the health, safety, and welfare of the community, and we're not doing that properly and fast enough. You have mechanisms that you can use. Outside of Port Hueneme, we have the lowest sales tax base there is, 725. Santa Barbara is 875, and I love this one, and Mr. Johnson and I have spoken many times. They have an earmark of 1% of sales tax that is a road use only. And since our visitors use the roads, all million of them annually, and if they want to visit Shangri-La and keep Shangri-La pristine like I do, they need to help us keep Shangri-La pristine. And I would urge a recommendation to council that we take a look at the sales tax. 1% sales tax increase will put us below Oxnard and most of the other communities in Ventura County. I mean, we only have one of the 10 cities that has a sales tax less than us. And they got a giant dope factory down there in Hueneme, so they're flush. We don't. The other thing is we seriously need to consider raising the TOT another 5% for a number of reasons. We're overwhelmed. We have reached the point where we have a tsunami. And if we're going to have to endure this tsunami, we need to make sure that the visitors here are helping us keep this place up. They're using it. We're 7,300 strong. They're $1 million a year. We do need them to partner with us to keep this place a place where people will want to come. And I would urge you to consider another 5% increase in TOT. Unrestricted this time, Mr. Johnson. Use it for what you want. But we need more money. We need more staff. We have a lot of deferred things. And I really think it's time that the TOT be looked at. Now, Mr. Wyrick and I disagree. We have the smallest fee on cannabis anywhere in the state. We have 3%. That brings in $300,000. And I'll do the math so nobody has to worry about it. That means we have 3 people with $10 million worth of sales in a city-restricted monopoly where they're paying $100,000 sales tax when San Luis Obispo has a permit that is in excess of that. So you have 3 sources of revenue. One is already authorized, which is cannabis. The sales tax will be a little bit tougher sale. And as one of our community social Facebook people said, if we raise the TOT to 20%, we'll be the highest in the state. And I said, that's great. Because we probably have a higher ratio of visitors to population than anywhere outside of maybe Solvang. We may be number 1 or number 2 for being overwhelmed, and I think it's okay. And it's not like we have a surplus. If we had a surplus, I wouldn't be saying this. But if we take the pensions and the road, we're $65 million under. I mean, we have such, and the numbers are probably wrong because the oil has gone up significantly. Construction and insurance have gone up significantly. And I'm sure James has got an idea of how long it would take to put us on a 10-year paving cycle to where all of the roads are deteriorated to Class C. We only have 15% Class A roads in the city, 15%. How can we be proud of that? I can't be. And I think it's time. This is a safety issue. So I'm sorry, James.
Thank you, Bob. No, you hit on a lot of important things, and we'll get to some of those. You caught me off guard without a timer, so.
I kept waiting for the red
Yeah,
light.
I know.
I'm sorry.
I didn't set it up for this meeting, but thank you for
You're
that.
welcome.
Any other public comment? Okay, Bill.
I like to follow Mr. Daddy, 'cause I can then appear to be succinct compared to people say I talk too much. Okay, I have 3 quick points. One is, obviously we did not pay down as we wanted to in terms of our long-term liabilities, the pension liability. We had a COVID budget crunch. Then we come out of the budget crunch. We didn't know how revenues were recovering. So I would agree now is the time in this budget cycle to get more aggressive on paying down that long-term pension liability. And I would hope the staff would help this by, I'm sure that there is an update on the rate of return for that pay down. Remember that that was part of the deliberation process that we would go through on the council, is to look at the rate of return for that more aggressive pay down beyond the minimum necessary. I have a feeling the rate of return on that has risen dramatically with this change in interest rate environment, and I would hope that that would further argue for getting more aggressive in this budget cycle with the pay down of the long-term liabilities. Mm-hmm. So that's my first point. Second point is that I also think that I hope that we revisit our cash management, because remember, at one point we were virtually doing nothing with earning interest on our cash management. The opportunity, and we got more aggressive on that, but I think now we have another change a sea change in terms of the cash reserve rates of return. And I don't know if we've revisited our investment policy. Mr. Molston, I think this is something also to look at in terms of, I know that the banks and the various fiduciaries beyond the banks are getting much more aggressive in saying, we're safe, we're not like SVB, and we, you know, the ones that can say that. And they're offering much better and more flexible terms on rates of return on cash reserves now. So I think that's something to look at, because that is foregone income if we can safely raise that by revisiting that, the policy of how we earn interest on our cash reserves. And I fully agree. That's another reason this is going, I think, a year to get more aggressive on getting closer to our 50% reserve, because the opportunity cost of not doing this in terms of foregone interest earnings has also risen dramatically. I mean, there are FDIC insured deposits paying 4% out there right now, or more. So it's something to really just think about. And I also hope that we really make sure we do a good job when we're matching in our budget projections the inflation side in terms of costs for the city services. Make sure we also understand what's going on the revenue side, because a lot of the retail people, a lot of the lodging industry, they are passing things on aggressively as well on the revenue side. So, you know, when we're trying to budget for things like the reserve or pay down of the liabilities, let's not shortchange ourselves on what's going to be happening in terms of increase in TOT by the lodging industries, passing on inflation costs in their TOT, and also we're going to see some of that in the sales tax. There's a lot of price increases out there that are going to, let's make sure we do an educated projections on both sides is my ask. So, thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other public comment? No, okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to the approval of minutes for August 9th. I know we had one member who was not on the committee at that time, so I'll ask the other three for a motion to approve the minutes, or if there's any comments on the minutes for the August 9th meeting.
One comment.
Sure.
I would like to thank you for putting
Microphone, please.
Oh, microphone. We were just reminded.
In the minutes, we have a idea on how we were going to support the recommendations for the public funds that we were going to expend.
At that time.
And I'd like to thank you again for having those available for us so that we could make a decision.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, a motion to approve the minutes.
Move for approval.
Thank you.
Move for approval.
Second.
Second.
Thank you. And
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
I won't be voting.
Sure.
But I still would, I was saying it partially in jest, but it says on the discussion and action items, or public comment, no public comments were submitted or received, followed by Bob Daddy spoke about the community.
Yeah.
And that seems like that should, just so we don't look like we
Yes.
rubber stamp the minutes.
okay, so we'll delete the no public comments were submitted or received. So, yeah, so approving it with that modification. We can do this just by consensus. Is there a consensus to approve? Okay, thank you. All right, so the August 9th Budget Committee agenda is approved. And now we can move forward to our discussion and action items. There's two on the agenda today. One is the budget, which we'll have a presentation for. But the first item is the general fund reserve policy. I want to give a very brief explanation because we've talked about it a few times over the years. And I think even at some point, I think we had said we were going to take action, and then COVID hit, and then we sort of held off. And so we may think we've done things that we haven't done, or vice versa. So very simply, back in 2001, the City Council adopted a resolution that created a general fund reserve policy. There's been the policy is not very clear, and it's in the packet. You probably saw it. It's essentially a couple paragraphs of substance. And so there's been a lot of discussion over 20 years of exactly, what the policy meant or how specific it was or what technically qualifies as the general fund reserve policy. And I've gone back and I found probably 7 or 8 times where we had discussions on that topic. And so right before the pandemic, I think it was actually a meeting in like January of 2020. We had a meeting and we talked about this, and essentially at that time the budget committee said, we sort of lost the forest for the trees, and take a step back, and just the big question was 50% of an annual budget is 6 months, so is 6 months of funding enough to survive an emergency? And we were at that time talking again before the pandemic, and we were like, well, our economy is pretty resilient, and like a lot of things we've said this a lot, that there's always been a feeling that if there was certain types of things like recessions that maybe Ojai wouldn't be as impacted because people from LA who would fly across country instead are just going to stay local. So maybe we always sort of have this built-in resiliency. And so we talked that through, but ultimately the budget committee said, I think it is time to be a little bit more careful and to look at extending or increasing that reserve policy. And the direction was for staff to come back and with a proposal to do that. Then a couple months later, the pandemic hit, and we were not even close to meeting our reserve policy, so we sort of put it on the back burner for a couple years. Over the last couple years, as we've started to try to build back up, we've kind of seen the good and the bad. I think we saw that our theory that it was very unlikely we'd have need to use 6 months of reserve policy in an emergency was not as solid as we had hoped, because during the pandemic, I know we've given this statistic a lot, but we went from we had never met the policy, so we had 4.5 months in reserve, I think, when the recession or when the pandemic hit, and we dropped to less than 1 month in reserve. We paused all projects, which is still having an impact today. There's still projects that we're trying to get unpaused. We stopped filling positions, which still has an impact to this day. We still have critical positions that we're trying to fill. Finance has one starting Monday that we've been trying to fill for a year plus at this point. So we saw that 6 months, or at that point, 4.5 months was not enough for that situation. If we had more in reserve, we would have been in a better position. We would have been able to take advantage of some of there were actually some points during the recession where costs actually sort of dropped because everybody stopped doing projects. And I think we actually had a meeting in 2020 where we talked about it would be great if we could take advantage of this, but we couldn't. And so looking forward, I think now with hindsight being 2020, we can see why we could see that 50% of our annual revenue, 6 months, is not an unreasonable amount. We could see that it's not bulletproof. And I think it's a good time for us to talk about really increasing it. And one question would be, obviously kind of two obvious numbers would be, 70%, 75% of an annual revenue, or 12%, or I'm sorry, 100% of an annual revenue, basically equating to having 9 months or 12 months in reserves. So obviously the budget committee would have flexibility there and could talk about it and decide to do something in between or something different. But those are the 2 points that I would recommend as sort of easy starting points. Well, that's it. And so this will tie in, I guess one more thing is the one reason why we wanted to do this really up front is because it'll tie directly into the budget. There are things that in the budget, things like the cannabis revenue, we automatically take the cannabis revenue and put it into reserves until we hit our reserve goal. So if we decide that we need to increase the reserve, then that impacts things like whether or not we would be able to spend any of the cannabis revenue. So just sort of explaining why it's important for us to sort of know which direction we're going to go with this as we move forward with the budget. So with that, I'll open it up to discussion and any questions. And I think we've always done these pretty informally, so we'll just sort of take questions or discussion.
I think my first question is, have we ever exceeded the 50%?
So we had never even met the 50% in 20 plus years.
That was sort of a rhetorical question. Where are we right now?
So as of our most recent closed fiscal year, because remember, we're in a fiscal year and we're projecting out at the end of the year, but as of the most recent closed fiscal year, we have met the reserve for the first time, and we are at about, I'm trying to do some quick math. I would say we're at about 7 months in reserve as of the close of the most recent fiscal year.
I know I understand, because in the past, we've never been in danger of exceeding it.
Yeah.
I frankly think that for a town our size, even a 75% reserve, because there's percentage sounds big, and then dollars are not as big in a town of 7,000 people that's sort of isolated with a fairly limited real estate tourist economy. When it goes in the tank, it goes in the tank. And as somebody who lived through 3 times when this town skated on the edge, and Steve was here for at least a couple, well, actually he was here for all of them. He was just a boy, though, the first time. So anyway, yeah, I think that, a suggested increase is a good idea. But I don't necessarily buy the argument that the original resolution wasn't clear. I think it was kind of messed with a little to get through tough times sometimes, to do things that people wanted to do. But the kind of reserve that I think was envisioned is something that's unencumbered, unallocated, and unrestricted, which means that the city council in an emergency has the total control of money that can be used to meet all needs. It is that, you were here, Steve. I think you were mayor at one time when this was debated.
That's true. And I was confused a little bit when I found that it wasn't all discretionary money, that some of the money that we count as reserve is allocated into certain programs and not discretionary, which I always thought was the intent, is to have discretionary money set aside that wasn't allocated into other programs.
Right. And when I came on the council, I found the same thing, and I looked at it and asked the question of staff, and I don't think it's happening now, but a lot of us who have sat through these meetings over the decades have seen where whether by I'll use the term collusion, coordination, or just ignorance, that money was being justified by taking everything from everywhere and saying, oh yeah, we got you 50% of the operating budget. For those of you who are less familiar with municipal finance, when I came to town 50-some years ago, these numbers sound ridiculous. The city general fund was $350,000. And they claimed to have somewhere between $350,000 and $400,000 in the bank. And when I took a look at it, I said, that's great, as long as you only want to spend it for all these restricted purposes, none of which paid for the general operation of the city. So they were basically just slightly above zero. So that's what this is supposed to solve, and I know the council back when they went through that horrible period where they really were down to basically running out of cash, period, because the county had to float you guys for a couple of years. So, yeah, I think, do we need a motion or something for?
Oh, do you want to go ahead?
Maybe
No.
some discussion first.
Well, I just want to say thank you, James. When you were talking about it, I could feel my heart pounding and my palms getting, and I think you shielded us, and thank you, Pam, in some ways from how dire it was that one month. I remember when we were talking about it, and then all of a sudden the inn opened up. Like, okay, everything's going to be fine here. So I would go for 100% because I think we saw that we really need that, and of course we live in an area of high risks, meaning fire, flood, earthquake, and we couldn't predict the pandemic, so that we need that security. And during a time of emergency, we probably need more staff rather than, you cut back. You didn't have an assistant for how long?
Ever.
I'm so sorry.
That's the goal. So we had an interim one for a few months, but we haven't. been
Yeah,
able to-
well, I mean, and that's not fair. So I don't want to see you go through that again or staff go through that again, and so that we really think ahead, because something will happen potentially. I don't mean to sound like Chicken Little or anything, but we need to be prepared.
Okay, well, what if we were to suggest that the city should consider the goal of 100% and set, but at a minimum of, and make it a realistic level like 75% that could be achieved within the next 2 years? That might be a little easier to swallow as a policy decision, and then see where things are. So
And
I would move that.
And I think in the past, it was a goal of 50%. It wasn't a request or a mandate. It was a goal that we wanted to make it 50%, and we never did till now. So
Well, I thought.
think,
Oh, go ahead.
well, I think that that's a reasonable addition, is to say a goal of 100%, but reality at 70 or 75%.
Yeah, I think I read, because I remember you and Sue worked hard on this back in those days when the inn didn't open on time and we went down to almost zero. But I think somewhere there is a document that says that it was more than just a goal. It was the target that, to be achieved as soon as possible, and then anytime money was taken out of that reserve to balance the budget, that it had to be repaid the following year immediately, because that, the temptation is like a Christmas account. I don't know if they still have those, but when I was a kid, you put so much aside each month or each week, and then when you got to December, you could buy presents, Well, yeah, but you could also draw the money out. And I'm one of 6 kids. Some of my siblings never had any money by December because they put it in one month and they withdrew it the next. They had needs. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I think you're right.
Yeah, the policy essentially was that we had to get 50%, and then if we were ever going to spend any of it, we had to actually declare an emergency. And then after we spent it, or when we spent it, we also had to have a plan for how it would be paid back
Yeah.
when we spent it. So there was some firmness to it, it's almost like, and it's easy for me to sort of look back and say this critically, but it's like, since we never had met it, we never got to the point of taking it seriously, and we needed to get to that point of taking it seriously. So we're doing that now. So.
One of the easiest ways to gradually build a reserve, if you're not too far off the target, is you budget, and then the management looks at it in the spring and sees where you are in terms of expenditures versus appropriations. And for any good management and controlled budget, you never come right to zero, and you don't want to be over, or you shouldn't be. The council shouldn't allow anybody to be over. What that means is that there's an available fund balance to roll forward. That is the difference between what the actual revenues were for the year and the actual expenses. You don't know that until you close the books at the end of the year. That money rolls into the reserve and stays there. And that's a relatively painless way to do it, but it only works if you're close to your target. It doesn't work if you've drained the savings account. So, where are we as far as what you need in the way of an action?
Couple questions. The 50% is 50% of our operating expense budget, Because in the letter, it's just operating budget.
Yeah, I know it's not clear. We've said we've done it as 50% of our total expenditures for the year. That's
Okay.
how we've figured out our percentages.
So if that's correct, then our 50% goal for 23-24 should be 6.7 million?
That's how you've calculated it?
With the estimated expenditures of 13 plus?
I thought it was 15.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
15.
No, see, I think we've been calculating it. I think we've been including transfers and things. Yeah, and there's a reason for that. And so, to answer your question, when people look at our budget, there's the operating expenditures, which in this proposed budget is 13.5 million. But then there's transfers and pension prepayment and the museum operating and all those things. I have been using the total of all those, which is $15 million in this proposed budget.
Okay.
For this reason, is those expenses don't go away during an emergency. And in fact, if during the most recent emergency, the museum came back and asked for more money. So it was like we couldn't, if we weren't, like the idea I think in the past when it was don't count things like that was that if there's an emergency, we'll stop doing them, but we didn't. And those expenses still continued. So when I've been figuring the general fund reserve, I've based it on all of the expenses with the idea that, of course, in an emergency, we would start trying to pare down what we can pare down. But to me, the general goal of the 6 month or the 6 month reserve was that in an emergency, we'd be able to cover all of our expenses for 6 months. That's my perspective. But that is the gray area that people argued about in the past, and we had budget committee meetings trying to debate those things. So.
And you mentioned we are currently at 7 months, but you didn't say what that actual number is.
Yeah, so as of June 30th, 2022, and I'm doing the math as I speak here, so pardon me if I'm off, but June 30th, 2022, it's about $11 million, and that was the close of the year. And so 11 million out of a $15 million budget. I came up with about 7 months in my head. I think that's about right.
Okay. Good, thank you.
And real quick, so Johnny, you said when you got here, they said they had $350,000 in reserve, and it was ridiculous. What year was that?
That was 1971.
1971. Because I could tell you that 2
They
years.
didn't say it was in reserve.
Oh,
They
yeah.
just said that's what
Oh,
they
their
had.
budget,
And
yeah.
it turned out to be
Yeah.
road money from the state of California and
Well, and
the
the
sewer
scary.
district that they operated and a cemetery.
It sounds ridiculous, but the scary thing is that in 2021 we only had 700,000. So
You know,
we've seen it go.
we had the
both
wrong
ways.
goal in mind, going backwards.
Yeah. So, the good news, I mean, you can see there from 700,000 to about 11 million. We've rebuilt very quickly, but a lot of that was by choice and, hard decisions, but some of those weren't by choice. And like, what I mean by that is we've been trying to restaff for 2 years. And the problem is it's very easy to reduce expenses and to start cutting things, especially in this economy. And I'm sure, Mr. Range, you probably get this too. It's hard to find good people to hire right now. And I would have loved to have hired some more people and spent a little bit more money. The good thing is it helped us build our reserve back quicker than we have in a long time. But my point is not having the reserve put us in a bad spot where we had no choice but to pause those things, and it's really it impacts the city long term. So.
I'd like to follow up on Jeff's comment. He's trying to figure out what we should be trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Where are we and how much do we have? But in the public comment from Mr. Daddy, he pointed out that the deferred maintenance on the roads, the unfunded liabilities that are out there, I don't see that particular data before us to know where it stands. Because let's say you had $10 million and you compared that to a $15 million budget, part of that $10 million is money that should have already been expended had the city been able or willing to take care of the roads and to pay down these deficits. It's counting the money kind of twice to look at it as free, unencumbered, unallocated, unrestricted. So I think this probably is a practical matter for those who have to get elected in town. They got to do something that is well justified, easily understood, and doable within, say, a 2-year period, because all the time I was on the council, and I suspect all the time Mr. Wyrick was on the council, that we got reports that indicated, oh, we're this percentage of the goal, and it was never true, and they never reached it. So doing something that could be measured and that this group could look at and say back, you know, give the council a report card saying things are going well, looking at the audits, would be a worthwhile thing to do. So my motion is that we ask or recommend to the council that they raise the limit to the reserve to 75% with the additional signing statement that says, and that in the long term, it should get to 100%, even though that doesn't bind the council to take every dime they get and shove it into the reserve at the expense of operating the city. So.
Sounds good.
Comment on this, because you bring up a question that needs clarification.
Yeah, we'll take public comment 1 second. One point I wanted to make real quick though. So 11 million of 15 million, which is our proposed budget, is about 73%. So that goal is not far off, that 75%. It's not a not realistic goal.
Maybe the mayor wants to bump it to 80% or something. I just
Well-
don't think, if you make it out of reach.
Okay, no, I get
Never
it.
get there.
That's
Yeah.
the point I wanted to make.
Okay,
Is
80 sounds
I should
good.
have said at the beginning, like where we were at, because yeah, knowing we never got to 50, it sounds like, well, why are we even talking about 75? But the point was we're finally at 50. So what's the next realistic goal? So
And we do need to look, or somebody needs to look at what is the total amount of money that this municipal corporation is obligated to pay at some point for unfunded liabilities to their pension, their medical insurance, their roads, to name just 3 biggies. You know,
millions, yeah.
Oh, and I like that, 80 sounds more reasonable, dream big for 100, but 80
I
sounds
accept
good.
that as fine.
And the other, just one other comment about what I saw during COVID. I mean, James, you basically had a whole nother job. You were a healthcare official, right?
And business shutdowner. I don't know what
Yeah.
word is that.
Yeah.
Business
What is that?
police officer
Just a
and
big downer.
job titles that I never want again, and hopefully we
No,
don't
so
have
you
them.
had, on top of your job, you had a whole nother hat that you didn't even know you'd ever wear,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Is there a second to any motion yet?
I'll second that motion.
And should we take public comment before
Yes.
we
Sure.
vote? Yeah. So Bob.
I've been to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of council meetings until recently. I'm really confused. I really don't like the way this discussion is going. And the
You never
reason,
do.
the reason I don't like the discussion is I'm affiliated with the largest casualty insurer in America. And I can give you any number you want. Tell me what you want, and I'll give you any number you want, and I'll justify it. And none of these numbers that you're talking about are going to work. And here's why. When we had lunch and we sat there and we looked at what the 5% was going to bring in income, it was really 2.5%. Because if we had a 50% reserve, we brought in $1 million, we lost a half of that because that went into reserve. So we really only had half of that. So when we take a look at what we're collecting, all the money we grow, in, and I sent you this a while ago, the property tax is growing pretty well because we're getting outrageous prices. So we're going to increase. If we increase $1 million or $2 million or $3 million, we automatically lose half of that at least to the reserve.
Only if you spend it, yeah.
Well, because we have about a $3 million deferred costs that we're not including in our budget each year.
Right, isn't that what I thought I said?
Yeah, okay,
Is
but-
that we need that to show, for these to be calculated properly.
Yeah, and so then when you take a look, I mean, getting to that 75, 80% number is going to be gruesome, and it's going to take a long time to get there.
So just real quick. So I think I understand, because I think what you're saying is that Measure C is going to
It's
make it
restricted.
impossible to meet the reserve.
Part of it's restricted money that you don't get to put in the general money. So you got to take that out, and you don't get to count that.
But so, to that point, but the Measure C, it is completely restricted. We set it up that way. So the revenue doesn't count in this discussion, or the spending doesn't count in this discussion. And so this is separate from Measure C. This is completely separate from Measure C. And they, partially because of what, the exact point you're getting at is it would have really, if we included Measure C in this discussion, it would skew the whole discussion.
And
Right.
for a while, the 300,000 cannabis tax.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you move this to 80 or 100%, you're moving the cannabis tax out another 5 or 10 years until that can be used.
Probably, yeah, I think so.
Okay, as long as that's explained in English to everybody, when we get a dollar, we get 25 cents. We don't really get a dollar. It's not really a dollar we can
Yeah.
go hire people with. It's not really a dollar we can do things with. And Mr. Olson was right, unrestricted versus anything you want to do. And when the inn, Thad Highland offered to pay the prior year TOT, well, the inn was going to be doing its couple-month remodel that ended up, 3-4 years? It took a long time to get our money back. The biggest threat I see to us is if we have some huge casualty issue at the inn, that will be years for them and us to recover.
What are you suggesting as an alternative to this, I say 80% hard line and a 100% goal? Are you suggesting it should be less, more?
I'm suggesting it should be more, but you need to get more by adjusting your revenue source.
Well,
Our TOT,
Bob, you're a tax and spend advocate?
no, we've already spent it through the deference. We're already in the hole. That's already gone. And we need to find a way to take care of what we didn't do for years.
Right.
So I don't want to tax and spend for more. I want to tax and bring us up level to par. And we're not there. We're not going to be there for, hell, I'm probably not going to be alive by the time we get 100% Class A roads. And,
You're
and
never going to get those.
and-
You'll be here.
yeah, I doubt it.
Yeah, it'll
and-
be recorded in the minutes.
and-
There's no public comment for Bob Daddy.
And $100,000 a year for 5.9 million in an unpaid pension. I mean, that's 59 years. That was a ridiculous suggestion. So anyhow, my thought is, a 1% sales tax brings in $1.7 million, and we can get rid of that debt around us in 4 years.
Okay, well, I don't necessarily
my-
disagree with you, but I don't think we're going to be advising tax policy to the council right now until we at least get certain things in place. And then when you apply the road budget and the pension deficit, like you're suggesting, then that should give a real picture to the council at budget time as to how they spend. And if they don't have enough money, then maybe they ask for the tax
But
increase.
let's put in the restricted funds and the current funds. Every year, it's $3 million.
Oh, you
That
mean
we
to
need to
maintain
spend.
the,
Every year, it's $3 million. We're getting further behind. And so that needs to go in there because we've incurred it in insurance. It's IRBM, incurred but not reported. And so that's what we're doing. So let's just be really transparent. The numbers are the numbers. You're not going to fix them or change them. They are what they are. But I think everybody needs to understand where we really are. And so if and when it ever comes time to recommend to the council, the community will understand that, yes, there was a need for revenue. Yes, there was a way to do it, and yes, there was a need. And we won't have to go through some of these issues. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate yet another opportunity to be more succinct to Mr. Daddy.
I don't think that word means what you think it means. But go ahead.
Number one, where Mr. Daddy and I disagree about the gross receipts tax on cannabis is something that has been well documented now at the highest levels of the state in terms of the cannabis regulatory situation. The state is beginning to recognize that the tax levels that we are doing on cannabis is incentivizing the black market. suppressing the legal market and depressing revenue. The state of California is getting less revenue from the cannabis taxation because they have gotten to the level of incentivizing the black market and not incentivizing the legal market. So that's something to take a look. Where he and I disagree is I think you need to analyze what the revenue maximizing tax rate is, not the absolute level of taxation. That's the difference. That's where he and I disagree. Number two, I think we've touched on another way of presenting this to the community and to the council and to everyone. It's a rate of return issue. If we fix streets sooner, they're less expensive to fix when we get them fixed. Okay, you don't have to you can do the overlay. You don't have to do the base rebuilding. So we can probably quantify that in some way, or at least suggest it as a rate of return on being more aggressive on getting on. You can't believe how more expensive it is to have to do the base when you don't do the overlay in a timely fashion, for example. We can probably present it that way. The rate of return on the cash reserves getting so much higher than it used to be, and the rate of return and the reduction of the pension liability by doing, being more aggressive. We can be presenting it in a positive fashion in terms of rate of return on a consolidated balance sheet position. And I think, Mr. Johnston, that's exactly the kind of way we need to look at it in terms of a consolidated balance sheet and the rate of return on deploying our assets, in terms of the global view. So anyway, those are my comments.
Thank you. Yeah, the paving is a really good point. We're out to bid right now on our pave job that had gotten delayed due to COVID and the impact on the funding. And when we looked, I think we have a list of about 20 streets getting paved, and 2 of them cost the same as the other 18 because those 2 are in just terrible condition. And we had other streets that were in as bad condition, but we had to decide whether we tried to do pave 20 streets or pave 3 streets or 4 streets with that whole budget. So there is a lot of that still to catch up on and do. And I think that's where, I like to think of the general fund reserve as in months, because for me in an emergency, how long do I have that I can run the city without panicking? But the point about our dollar amounts being very small is a good point to reiterate, because 6 months at one point was $4 or $5 million. When COVID hit, it was $4 or $5 million. And so when you only have $4 or $5 million in the bank, and we didn't even have that at that point, I think we had 3.4 going into COVID. You can't afford to pave. It doesn't matter if it's 50% or 100%. We couldn't afford to pave. $3 million was not going to cut it, and we couldn't use all of that. So the small dollar amounts, if you're a big city and 50% is $100 million, well, you can still pave, but if we don't have more than a certain amount, we just have to postpone things, and that's what happened during COVID. So,
Well, do you, I thought when I left the council that there was a separate fund for capital repair and improvements.
correct.
Okay. And funds are normally used to restrict the ability for that money to be just scooped up without going through a fairly laborious process of amending the budget.
Yeah.
So as long as the council appropriates a reasonable amount of all new income to try to pay down this whole road thing, which whoever said it is absolutely right. It's more than 10 to 1 if you wait too long to repair a street. 10 cents to overlay or to slurry, or $1, and a half to rebuild the roads. You're having that experience, but without that budget, and that's not something that we can do here today, we don't know. So those numbers, that Jeff was asking for and that I was asking for, we don't know what that maybe would be committed to. So maybe another meeting like this with a little more information would make it easier for us to, understand.
And we still have the budget presentation still to come. So, so we'll get into a little bit more of that. The budget presentation's why we have the TVs on. Shoot.
Do you want us to make a recommendation on
just real
on the reserve, or would you rather wait on that until you finish?
I think we can move forward with the reserve, but the point, to your point real quick, so the city has the 20%, or had a policy to transfer 20% of every dollar from a hotel to the CIP for paving, although that wasn't in the policy, that was always sort of the practice. The problem was in the pandemic, particularly 20% of zero is zero. And so we had a couple of years, we talk about it, the worst month that we had in Ojai, and hopefully the worst month we ever have in Ojai was April of, is it 20 or 21? 20, I think. It was one of those two. But April of 20 or 21, the city received $6,000 in hotel tax revenue. And so, 20% of that, real quick math, is $300. You can't pave much with $300. So that's where to your point, yes, we transfer a portion of that funding to pay for paving. But in an emergency, when that money stops coming in, if you don't have any money, you can't pave, whether it's, one way or the other. So.
But if the policy was to transfer 20% of what was believed to be a normal income from the bed tax,
Yeah.
and we didn't do that as a city because of the emergency of COVID, the streets still continued to deteriorate.
Correct. Yep.
And got even worse with all, we're blessed
The
with water
rain.
and cursed now with no streets or with potholes. Okay, so if you were to take that 3-year period or whatever it is, look at what the money would have been had we had the money coming in, and take that from that number you were giving to me and Jeff, and take that and shift it over and have that available to pave the roads, which fits in with what Bob Daddy was saying, that would give a much clearer picture, would it not, as to where we really are in terms of our reserve? Because some
Yep.
of the money that's come into the reserve is, this is a bumper crop this year, and then we had 3 years of famine that
Yep.
nothing went into the fund. I think that it should be looked upon as a continuum of 20% per year. And if the money's not there, obviously you can't transfer it, but then you catch up with it.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
And that's separate and aside from the unencumbered, unallocated, emergency reserve.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, so, to that point, we're talking about the reserve, and I think I heard you say that we're currently at 73%.
As of June 30th, 2022.
So my recommendation would be to be satisfied with what we have for now. Take those funds and make them unrestricted so that we can use them in case of an emergency. And until we get caught up on the roads and the pension, be satisfied with 75% of reserve emergency funds. But that would allow us to, in fact, get caught up on our road and pension.
Any comments?
How much of that cash that we're talking about, that 73% is really in the reserve, that it isn't indirectly a deferred payment into the road fund and other places?
Oh, well, yeah, for example, we deferred the transfer to the road fund for 2 or 3 years. So just quick math, I think, because it used to be about $1 million. Well, it used to be about $800,000 a year. So we probably deferred a couple $1 million over the last 3 years.
Yeah, so if you took $2 or $3 million, I just, from when I was on the council, that's what it would have been, and take that $3 million away from, whatever you were figuring into your 73%.
The
It's not
11
percent
million.
anymore.
Yeah, from 11 million to 8 million, basically. Yeah.
So
Are you
Jeff,
following what I'm saying, Jeff? Yeah.
is
that
it,
it's,
and that, what you're saying, I think, is 75%, but it's discretionary money, it's not restricted money.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's what I was discussing earlier, is, like how much of it is designated to something else and not really in a reserve because it's supposed to be over here.
Right, when I asked the question about the separate funding for capital, that's the way in which you can kind of create, sort of more than a Christmas account, and you say that money stays there. That's already spent. It's just a question of awarding contracts, because we know that, I haven't seen the number, but I'll guess it's got to be well north of $20 million in this town to get our streets up to a reasonable level. And we weren't putting the money over there that, this is hard to talk about in the abstract, because without seeing it on paper, it's really hard to understand. But I was told that $600,000 a year during the term I was mayor for 4 years was going into this capital account. And then when I looked to see what was being spent on roads out of that, it was like $150,000. So somebody was jiggering the books, and it wasn't at least it wasn't my truth as to what was supposed to be going on. It seems to me that we should be recommending that the city council, when they adopt their budget and they make a transfer to pay road money, it's not absolute like the state, because nobody else is imposing this, but it is something that they do, and they fundamentally move that money over, and it's encumbered. It's no longer part of an emergency reserve, and then people actually take care of the roads. One of the problems we're faced with, editorializing, you may recall about 5 years ago when in the sewer district and the state of California and the city and everybody was doing projects, every street in town, and detours were up, and noise, and people were dust, and people were furious. You know, if we were to try to catch up every other year, or whatever our previous public works guy thought was a great idea, you know, at some point you got to do it all at one time. And boy, those of you who have to be elected to public office in this town are going to have your phone ring off the hook. So. So we need to put the staff in a position, if the council will agree, to where there is money, and the public works director and the city manager can go ahead and start coming up with an actual road maintenance project and do it. I don't know when the last street was paved in town, but I suspect it was the first year I was on the council, and that's 5 years ago. And that's a really bad omen for all of this. So. Okay, I'll shut up, or we're never going to get.
I have one more thought. We spent $2.8 million during the COVID. Over what time period did we spend it?
Spent 2.8. I'm not sure what that refers
Well,
to.
our reserves prior were 3.4. We spent down to 700,000.
I think that was from March of 2020 to March of 21, about a year.
About a year. So 8 million is going to get us about 2.5, close to 3 years in worst case scenario survival.
Under old costs.
Under old
That's what I was
costs,
going to say. You could probably reduce that 50% with how costs have increased, or costs have gone up by about 50% since then, is what we're
And
saying.
that also, in the balancing act, that's not paying anybody anything. You don't have, dragging back on payables, the whole thing,
Yep.
So it doesn't give us
4 more years of
they
delaying street
stretched it
paving.
out only on a cash flow basis, not on
Yeah,
a.
I would not recommend, this I could say, it's like, I'm not political, but I would never recommend doing what we had to do
Yeah,
during
I
the
wouldn't.
pandemic. And I'd probably quit if we had to do it again, because it was not a good time. We really went bare bones. We canceled projects. The only project we did during the pandemic was, and it was funny, there was a point where it looked like I would be wrong to do this, but I okayed the $20,000 to do the turf hill at the park, because I figured we'd do something positive for the community. And there was a point where people said, well, what if that was the $20,000 that is make or break? And we did, if everybody remembers too, because we had to talk about it at this committee, we had to hire somebody to start looking for loans, and we had to do all that. So for me, I would not, I'm looking to put us in a situation better than we were in, rather than trying to be in that situation again. We survived it. I mean, I guess we could look at it that way, but it was not, I wouldn't say we thrived during the pandemic.
Yeah,
We
I'd like to
survived it.
reiterate that. It was gnarly.
Yeah.
And thank you once again, James, for shielding us from the horror at a certain point. And just to go back to the paving, that is the number one thing I hear on a daily basis. Pave, pave, pave. So just making sure that happens, and that it's publicized. The community really knows that we're focusing on it. And I know that is one of your top priorities too, so.
Yeah.
Read your government code, which is very boring reading, but if you read that, I think it'll say that the city manager, the public works director's primary responsibility is to maintain the infrastructure of the community, you know, and that means with regular repairs and what have you, and this town has never followed that, you know, at least not with any diligence, and then you inherited both of, you came when the Thomas Fire came.
Yep.
You certainly brought a lot of cheer to the town. James. And then you had, then we had the COVID, and the earthquake hasn't shown up yet, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that we had a doomsday. When we had this meeting a couple times, we had the
Yeah.
date of when we were gonna run out of money.
Yep,
And then,
yep.
then the next meeting that we'd have, okay, it's 2 more days later.
Yep.
You know, like it's exact when
Yeah.
we were gonna run out of money. It was
Yeah.
scary.
And when the thing about that was, and this was like the most frustrating thing during the pandemic, remember, was like the hotel could reopen, but then there was a rule that it couldn't reopen. And so they were sitting there ready to reopen, and we were like, if they get the okay to open, we'll survive. If they don't, we won't. And it really was that close during the pandemic. So,
Well, I would like to say thank you to the Ojai Valley Inn, our mothership, for opening at the perfect moment.
yeah, so there's a lot to it, but yeah, that's the reality of this. We did survive the pandemic, but how we did that was postponing paving. And I could tell you, nobody comes up to me right when I walk around town and thanks me for postponing paving. You know, nobody appreciates that, and I'm not proud to say that that's what we had to do, but that's how we did it, and we postponed projects. There's a bus shelter that we've been working on for 7 years, and that got paused, and now it's hard to get unpaused because contractors aren't available to. The contractors have all this infrastructure money and everything being thrown at them, and they're putting our small projects on the back burner, which is another thing that happens for Ojai, is that we're typically the smallest client with the smallest job, and so we wait for everybody else. So there's just a lot of impacts, and so the good news is we know we can do it to survive, but the bad news is we know it's not a 6-month delay or a year delay, it's years, you know, so.
Johnny,
Money out
I
there.
second your motion.
Okay.
So
Okay.
you want to repeat it? Because I think
I think that we recommend to city council that they raise the reserve level to 80%, and that with a signing message that it really should probably go to 100%, but let's do it in steps. And the council has a certain amount of latitude even with all that. They've exercised that latitude intentionally or unintentionally over the years, so it's not like they're being tied up by the federal government or something. But if they don't have that goal, then the city manager, how does he prepare his budget each year and give a coherent message to the community, when even amongst us, how difficult it is to understand how things interplay. So if they set the 80%, that means that chances are by the end of this year or next, they will be there, unless it turns out that if you keep the books properly on transfers and what have you, you may find yourself at 60%, not at 73%.
Well, in our paving bid, we just got a call a couple weeks ago that they think it'll be $1 million more.
Yeah,
So 30% increase, so $2 million bid becomes $3 million. So
Same work.
for the same work, the bid that we went out to bid on 2 months ago that we're getting ready to close, the estimate has gone up $1 million. So, there might be some decisions to that point where
Now,
we
we're
might have
at
to make
the
those
top of the market again.
yeah.
Jesus.
Okay.
Do we want to add the term unrestricted
Yeah.
to our?
Well, that, I was gonna ask, does that motion meet what your requirement, or do you feel like
Microphone?
add the
Microphone, please. We're being reminded.
just wondering if we want to add the unrestricted money as the component of the reserve, rather than
Require that it be unrestricted.
Yeah, I mean, what it should be is so that they can't be counting money that they've already in
That's
some
exactly
fashion
right.
committed to
That's what
something
I think
else.
the intent of Jeff's
Is that what you're getting
comment.
at? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. I think it should be unencumbered, unallocated, unencumbered, and
Right.
unrestricted, which means that money is really cash and will be there and can't be touched except for emergencies.
I agree. And that's my notes here from reading it over, is that if I remember from our prior meetings, that I couldn't believe that that money wasn't really a reserve. It was,
Yeah, it wasn't, well, and I think that was by interpretation of the finance department back when they were just, it's unkind to call it cooking the books, but they gave themselves the slack, and every time the question came up, we'd get this unintelligible explanation. And fortunately, with our new finance, well, they're not new anymore, but with Pam and with James, they got it cleared up a lot, but then the money went away. So we had a clear statement, but no money.
It's easy when it's zeros.
Okay,
Okay. So is that a consensus?
all right, yeah.
Okay.
We-
Thank you.
Do we need to vote on it or anything?
I guess so. I'll just go down the line. Johnny,
Yes.
Jeff, sorry.
Yes.
Betsy,
Yes.
and Steve Olson.
yes.
Thank you. All right, and so now we'll get to the budget presentation.
Oh, boy.
I'll actually try to keep it brief. I know we sent just the budget worksheet out. I do think we'll do another that's more focused on some of the things like the salaries in comparisons to other cities, but we wanted to start big picture, high level, because it's just been such a weird few years, and like my first thought is like everybody's probably just wondering like what are we even looking at, big picture. So I'm gonna ask James Hahn is in the back. Can you push each slide? Yeah, I'll say next. So I want to start real quick with just some information that I thought was interesting. This first slide shows that the California auditor each year has started to do a ranking of city finances and ranking the risk of each city. And they've just done an update that I'll get to in a minute, but I wanted to start with looking at the 2019 to 2020, which was sort of the height of COVID impacts. And we can see, looking at this chart, that we typically think that Ojai, that we have the budget we need and that we're making progress, but you can see that in 2019 to 2020, we were considered a moderate risk city. So Ojai is the yellow, towards the top of the map, but there's also that box there. Yeah. So, thank you. The box there is important. The map shows that I think a lot of people go, Ojai's fine. Ojai's green because there's green, yellow, red. We've been yellow as many years as we've been green. Ojai kind of goes back and forth between like moderate risk and low risk. And what happens is, to kind of the point earlier, is when the Thomas Fire hits, we move very quickly from low risk to moderate. When COVID hit, we moved very quickly from low risk to moderate, which sort of illustrates the point, going back to the reserves, of why our reserves is important, because we are we're in a very sensitive situation where, like we keep saying, if three businesses shut down and they're key businesses, we're in trouble instantly. So the other interesting thing about this, and I know we took the picture with the box, but it was because I thought the box was interesting, that it shows you also when we start to cut what things we immediately start to go into the next risk category. So our reserves in 2019 to 20, we were in the yellow category, and that actually looks better than it really did in real life, because this is looking back now after the year closed and things started to reopen. So at the end of the year, we were in the yellow moderate risk. But I can guarantee that there were points during that year that if the year had just happened to end on the date that they did the test, we would have been in the red on that category, and probably in the red overall. It also shows yellow for our revenue trends, because our revenues actually dropped during the pandemic. It shows yellow for our pension funding and pension costs and our future pending costs, and then red for our other post-employment benefit funding. And that's what really stuck out to me, because obviously we've been talking about paving a lot. That's a priority. It's the priority that everybody sees. But to Bob's point, and I guess he snuck out at some point, there's more than just that. There's other liabilities, pension costs, OPEB costs. And the other one we just talked about is our reserves going down. So you could see that even the state looking at Ojai said, these are the issues. These are the risks that you have coming, and the risks that we have to prepare for. And so I wanted to start this because in our budget and in our reserves discussion, we are looking at trying to address those categories to try to make Ojai have less
Okay,
risk long
well,
term.
where, I don't see it up there, where deferred road maintenance.
Correct.
Or public works.
Correct.
Which is the big elephant that we face.
Yeah, no, and this is like, that is the thing. The way the state auditor does it is they're basing it based on our, our salaries, benefits, pensions, revenues.
Yeah.
But they aren't going out and looking at, are you keeping your streets in
Right.
good condition and those things. And we know we haven't been. There's no hiding that. I've said this recently, we're trying to do a 5-year plan to get to a passing pavement score. We're in the final year of what ended up being a 13-year plan that ended with us being at a score of 53 is the paving score. 53 is failing, So we had a 12-year plan to fail, So the goal is moving forward, we have to be disciplined enough to have a 5-year to
So
actually
my point
pass.
would be that if we were, goes clear back to 2019, 2020, there's been virtually no paving for the last 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And if you took and actually accounted for that, even if it at a modest amount, it would change some of those things where it says we're at moderate risk. I
Oh
would
yeah, if
think.
we had taken the $2.5 million that should have been transferred, that
Yeah,
is now
right.
in reserves, we would have been high risk. This is not intended to be reassuring. It's intended to tell us
I
that
know, but it's a really
we
good
survived,
way-
but it was not good.
Yeah, I think the way what Bill and Bob were saying in the public comment, that this would make an adaptation of this would make a good pictorial of where we are
Right.
when it's brought up to date for your coming budget.
Yeah,
And that would-
and plus the
If people are going to want to say, when they want something from the city council, they're going to say, oh, well, you're only moderately at risk, or you're not, you're agreeing on this, so why don't we get some more money from you? If it actually, everything's in there, it isn't a criticism of your management or the city council's policymaking. It's just, it's an accurate picture, so that
yeah, no, that's a good point. I guess there's always optimists, right? Glass half full. I
Well, yeah, they
I
only-
definitely see glass half empty or more empty. With
yeah, but they
this.
only do that when they're trying to get you to include their particular.
Yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, so no, and all deferred maintenance across the board. We've been talking about paving, but even the Boyd Center, probably again this year we have work that we need to do at the Boyd Center that when we're starting to budget, it looks like we're going to push back the work on the Boyd Center another year. So there's a lot to it. Next slide, please, James. So I had a slide for our reserve policy discussion, so I should have pulled that up. Next slide, please. So again, I'm going to probably be mostly high level today and just explain some of the basics. But so at a very high level, we wanted to show the budget over the last 4 years and going back into the year of COVID, which again, when you look at this chart at the end of the year, we almost ended up balanced, but it was because the way the fiscal year works, the hotels were able to reopen and they were able to start making up money. But there were points in the year where we were different points where we were $3 and $4 million underwater that year. But so from COVID and kind of our pre-COVID budget, I think, was about $11 or $12 million, and then COVID hit, and it was closer to $9 or $10 million for a couple of years. And then coming out of COVID, and with COVID being such a sort of weird situation, the revenues did jump back up. We had revenues of $15 million. Now with the closing that fiscal year, we know that we ended up at about $15.5 million on June 30th, 2022. But the chart is a little bit misleading because it looks like, our expenditures were $10.5 million and we have a surplus of $5 million, and that sounds like we'd be in a great situation and in great condition. But the reality was that was starting to rebuild the reserve, and also that reflects the situation I mentioned earlier of we could not hire people and we could not get projects, contractors to do projects. And so, again, the expenditures were $10.5 million, but that wasn't by design or by choice, and it wasn't covering everything we needed to do. It was just getting by doing the things that we could do with the staff and the resources that we had.
You're explaining that surplus or the shortage,
The surplus in 21, 22.
right?
Yeah.
21, 22? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, that's,
Yeah, almost $5 million.
okay.
Yeah. Rebuilding the reserve and then trying to get our staff
That's in the
back.
numbers you were giving us earlier, right?
Yes, yes. So that when that 5 million went in, that's when our reserve on June 30th, 2022. That date is the same date that we gave the reserve number based on.
Okay.
So it includes that. So 22, 23, what we're projecting right now, and again, we haven't finished that year. And also we've heard recently from some of the hotels that business has slowed down over the last couple months, whether that's weather or something else. So these are projections. The revenues may not come into what we thought based on what we're hearing back, but the projections are that our revenues actually will slightly drop a little bit from 21, 22. And then our expenditures are starting to go up because we were able to start staffing up and hiring and training and everything in that period. So this year we end up at about a $2 million surplus if it goes the way we think we're going, but that's a projection.
That's a fund balance to roll forward. Right?
Correct.
And roll it forward into
Yep.
the reserve.
Yep, which might help us get to maybe where our goal is if the year ends the way we think it is. But the key point there, I think the thing that this shows the most is really two things, is sort of how the revenues recovered, but they aren't necessarily, it recovered back from COVID and then it's sort of flat or even maybe a little bit of a drop. It's not like, it's not a continued, the chart doesn't keep going up forever because we have limited capacity. I'll talk in a moment about the Roblar
Now, the
hotel opening.
23, 24 column, that's the budget that you're proposing for next year, right?
Yes. And
And it shows that right now, based upon projected revenues and estimated expenditures, that you'll be 200,000 short, right?
correct.
Okay.
And
so-
and the rest of the presentation will explain why that is the case.
And that's not even taking into account catching up the money that we didn't put into the road fund for 3 years, right?
Not catching up, although starting to re-implement, but not catching up, not making up for the 2.5 million.
Right. See, because the way I'm looking at it is, if you have a separate fund where it was intended that a certain amount of money would go to for road depreciation and repair, and you don't do it just because you didn't have the money that year, that doesn't mean the depreciation and the issues aren't still there. So when you do have the money, that money should actually be going into that fund, and it does not, which would make the potential shortage in the coming year greater
Yeah.
if they paid all their bills.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But so real quick, the second point, I think, so I was saying how sort of the revenue trend from this and how it's sort of flattening and maybe even dropping a little bit and recession looming. But the other is the expenditure trend. And so it illustrates sort of the life we've had over the last couple of years of we had to cut really quick, get down to 10 million, and then now it takes a year to get up to 12 million because you have to find and train and get contractors and all that. And then now the goal is to get back to sort of our old staffing level and what we used to do. With the cost increase, we're looking at about a $15 million budget. And so I'll get to it in a minute. We're talking about maybe adding a couple of positions, but really almost all of that is just getting back to the level that we used to be pre-COVID. So. No, ATP is separate because it's a capital improvement project. But I do have a slide here towards the end that'll talk about that because every capital improvement project is going over budget, period. I think the only ones that aren't right now for some reason is our roofing contracts are the only ones that are coming in where we expect them. Everything else is going up, prices are going up. And so, you know, when kind of big picture is we may have to look at how to make up some of those costs, so.
So you're saying the 15,100,000 is not necessarily a good figure if you do all the things that you need to do based on cost increases?
Well, remember, so this is the general fund budget.
Yeah.
And so that's where all, like the paving and everything else is CIP budget. It's a separate
Oh,
budget.
okay. So-
But the point is, as those costs go up, we may have to transfer general fund to be able to do some of those things or postpone projects. So we talk a little bit about that at the end, but that's why the paving's not mentioned at this point, so. Yeah, so 23, 24, I think is actually gonna be fairly flat. I don't see, if the inn is fully booked and they're at record high rates, I don't see how that is gonna go up next year. And in fact, I think it's probably more likely that prices start to come down or occupancy starts to maybe drop off a little bit, because they're more fully booked. And I know we're just talking about one business, but I think it's pretty reflective. But they're more fully booked than they've ever been, but then it's starting to slow down, and it's like, is that just a temporary thing, or is that, you know, the weather, or what is that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so if it wasn't for Roblar opening, I would have projected, or I think we would have projected it to be really flat. But with the Roblar opening, we did project a slight increase just with those, additional. I think they're going to end up being about 50 rooms. So
And when do they think they're gonna open?
January, or I think they're going back and forth between January and March.
They won't be open.
Yeah, and so
They
so we
always
don't
slide.
project it for a full year. We proportioned it down, thinking
Right. So
maybe
you're
half a
giving
year.
yourself maybe 3 months worth of income that you probably won't see.
Mhm, exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And then the other big opening, which I don't think will contribute much, like directly, but maybe more kind of indirectly, is the Playhouse Theater is sort of on the same timeline as the Roblar. And I doubt that their sales tax would be very much, because I just don't, movie theaters I don't think generate that much, but it might help maybe get more people out and spending, So we projected revenues to be like kind of a slight increase, but otherwise relatively flat. After a couple years where, we saw a big jump, but it's sort of flattening out. So next, well, actually, can you go back 1 second? I always forget what my footnotes are there. So I just make the point that, what the expenditures reflects is that it takes a while for us to start hiring, training, et cetera. So we're sort of on that route. We went from 10 million to 12 million, to what we're proposing is 15 million next year. And a lot of that is, I think it's about $1 million that we're proposing the increase in staffing just to get back to the, standard level, and then a couple key positions. Including your assistant. That is in the budget this year, yeah. And then I'll get to it later, but just a couple. There's a couple other things, like our rec department was running bare bones to because we weren't really sure, like, if we'd be able to really get people back and recreating and everything. And so we've been running with a smaller staff than we used to. So we're proposing to sort of start building that back up, because they're starting to fill up again as people get comfortable. So next slide, please, James. So some of the assumptions on which we base these revenues, and we've answered a couple of these, but we are projecting conservatively, for all the reasons we've discussed, but also because of the warning signs right now of potential recession. And then, like we said, all the things like, our hotels, they're not building more rooms, so I don't see big increases coming in those types of things. So most of the revenues are in line with maybe slight increases, a couple percent as compared to the prior fiscal year. We always talk about our big three, which is property tax, sales tax, and hotel tax. Property tax right now is coming in lower than we budgeted this year. And then sales tax and hotel tax are coming in higher than what we budgeted this year. But next year, we basically projected them to be pretty much flattening out. All of those things was flattening out. Again, I guess the point here is from COVID to the next year, we expected these big increases in the curve, the curve to really go up. Now we're in the period where we think it's going to flatten. And then if there's a recession, it could potentially even start to drop. So we talked about this, but the numbers we propose anticipate the opening of the Roblar Hotel, but not really much expected until 2024. For cannabis, revenues went down this year, which is the first time that's happened for the city. I think that will either continue to happen or at least not go up because every other city is opening cannabis dispensaries, and I think that's part of why ours
James,
trended down.
how do you guys track that particular income with the federal government still not allowing them to have bank accounts and stuff?
Well, so it's a good question, and so something Pam and I are working on, and if we had the time, I would have brought it today, but to the committee. But I think the committee had actually told us, had supported it before. We need to check the minutes of that, but we're looking at actually doing audits of the cannabis dispensaries, and we're planning to recommend that to the council because it's an all-cash business, so it's sort of the honor system. Is there a better? Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Potentially, they're honoring themselves first. They
Yeah.
don't have a good
Yeah,
honor.
well, and the revenues went down, and I was surprised. That one surprised me. When we look at the numbers every couple of months, most of the time, I'm like, that's what I figured. But the cannabis one, I was really surprised that it went down because everybody knows Oxnard and Ventura were going to open a bunch, but they haven't. Or that keeps getting slowed down and everything. So I thought that ours would still be trending up in the meantime, but it has gone down.
And I would think that particular market, with us being a tourist destination, would be fairly steady with the tourists. Locals might go somewhere else,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
yeah.
And then the other thing was we had given those 3 licenses to dispensaries, and then the city gave 2 licenses for manufacturing, and neither of those they both got the permits and then just sort of sat on the permits. So they haven't started. We have received no revenue from either of those. So last year we had projected revenue for that. This year we're just taking that out. The other thing, this is more an expenditure, but maybe it shows up in the chart. But we are proposing reinstating the transfer from the hotel tax to the CIP that we've talked a little bit about, but at 10% in this budget. That's obviously an area that based on the discussion, the committee said reinstated at 20%, we can do that, but it would also mean $600,000 that we'd need to then figure out what we aren't going to do this year. So that's worth a discussion at some point, I think. But I will make the point of that the hotel tax went up so much in the last couple years that 10% of the TOT transfer is about the same as what 20% used to be. But at the same time, it also costs more to actually do anything with it. So it is like somebody said, everything's interconnected. It really feels like that right now. And then the Playhouse, like I said, is on pace to open, but we didn't really project much for it because it won't be, I don't think it'll be this year, and I don't think it'll be a huge impact on our budget. So next slide, please. So just looking in a little bit more detail, I won't go through it too long, but just at like some of the key revenue categories and what's changed. And really, if you look at the chart, what's changed is tax revenues went up. Everything else has kind of remained flat, or maybe was impacted due to COVID, but has returned to sort of normal levels. But the tax revenues have gone up. And then if we boiled that down even more, it's the hotel tax has gone up. Everything else has been relatively flat over the years, except for maybe an odd year from COVID. And so I think no surprise, but it just keeps reaffirming that even in all these situations, the hotel tax is really what decides if we have a good year or a bad year from a financial standpoint. Next slide, please. So we already looked at the state auditor's report, and we already talked a little bit about it. But the reason why we wanted to show that as an illustration is because when we did look at expenditures, that is why we targeted those things that, and it was independent. We had already said, we looked at our budget and we said we need to deal with our pension costs, we need to deal with our OPEB costs, we need to build up the reserve. And then a couple weeks ago, the state puts out a report, and those are all of our higher risk categories. So it's not because of this, but this sort of reinforces that I think we're on the right path with targeting those things. And so next slide, please. When we talk about expenditures, it's sort of those, did we skip a slide, James? Yes, we did. It's sort of those categories, the liabilities, the deferred maintenance, the pension costs, and then the other one that we have to deal with that doesn't show up on that checklist from the state is our staffing. So you could almost look at all of the expenditures that we increased this year are in those categories. We're trying to target those things. And so, for example, for liabilities, we've had the $100,000 unfunded pension liability for several years. I think it's been 7 or 8 years. Yeah, the OPEB prepayment. Last year, the budget committee recommended also prepaying the pension liability. So it was, we had always prepaid for 7 or 8 years, we had prepaid the retiree medical. The committee recommended we also start prepaying pension liability. So we did that last year for the first time, $100,000 in each category. You know, to Bob's point, $100,000 doesn't solve everything in a year, but we thought at least starting to do that. In this proposed budget, we increase it to $150,000 for each of those, with the idea of being starting, you know, kind of year by year, increasing that and trying to prepay that liability faster and faster. So that's proposed in the budget. The deferred maintenance, we try to start addressing that by re-implementing the transfer that I mentioned a moment ago of the hotel tax to the CIP. So it's re-implemented at 10%, which is $609,000 is 10% of the hotel tax. So trying to, really the thought process behind it was if we re-implemented that, that'll cover the new cost overage of the paving from the cost increases in the recent years. Third bullet point there is staffing. The budget does propose a cost of living increase, and it includes an increase to training budgets to try to start investing in our staff. We've had a lot of staff our turnover. I think most agencies are seeing that right now. A lot of people have decided it's time to retire or get into different fields. So most agencies are seeing turnover, and we've been building a good team, but we have a lot of people that we need to train, and a lot of people that are starting, but they don't. It's a lot to learn in a short period. The other thing we looked at is last year, as the budget committee, we did a salary survey looking at other cities, and we made a couple of adjustments based on seeing other cities pay certain positions more. But what we noticed this year is that, in particular, our public works crew seems to be getting recruited away. And so we looked at where they were going, and what we found is that they aren't going to other cities, they're going to other Ojai Valley agencies. Casitas, the sewer district. I think we have a board member who might know about taking some of our people. I'm just kidding. Yeah.
One water district. For sure.
Yeah, water district. And so we would have been looking at most of our positions. You would think it would be, city manager is going to be recruited, or a finance director is probably going to be recruited by another city. But our public works employees, when we looked at other cities and we're like, well, that's weird, we're paying them fairly. But then what we didn't realize is other agencies in the valley were increasing pay. And so we've lost a couple recently, And so we looked at those agencies, and we see that we are falling behind those agencies for our public works positions. So the budget also includes, on top of the cost of living for all of the employees, it includes a 5% increase for those public works positions to try to compete with those other agencies. And then the budget also includes a couple other key enhancements. One thing I've heard about Ojai that I think is true is that we don't keep a lot of institutional knowledge. And I think sometimes it's talked about like it's a mystery of why that happens. And I can tell you, like, from this side, there's not much of a mystery to it. When you only have one person who does each job, if that person leaves, you lose the knowledge. And there's not a lot of cross training. There's not a lot of overlap because we sort of have one person departments or, one person divisions. And so what I wanted to do and what I'm proposing is looking at some key positions where it would be good to have some redundancy, where the workload justifies it, but also getting a second person would help, where if one person leaves, you aren't starting over from scratch with somebody where you have to hire for 6 months, train for 6 months, and you have no institutional knowledge. And so the key one that I really am focused on is the additional planner. And we can do that relatively simply because we've always had contract planners. And so, and we had contract planners, I think, because we always had a hard time finding planners. But we've had opportunities recently. We had started internships and things where we have people that we can hire, and then we can actually have somebody on hand who is learning how Ojai does things and how learning our code and learning, at our planning commission meetings, when people come in and say, everybody knows that we don't support these types of projects. Well, a contract planner doesn't know that because they're working from a, skyscraper in LA and just looking at all plans the same. Having a planner on hand who would be here learning and who would know that. And then if we have we would end up having 2 planners. We only have 1 planner right now. And so if we had a second planner and one leaves, we wouldn't be immediately dependent on contractors exclusively. So that's really a key one for me as far as institutional knowledge and some depth. The other one, another similar thing, is our IT division has always been a 1-person IT division. And so we are more and more dependent on IT, and the website goes down one day now and it's a big deal, or maybe 5 years ago no one would have noticed. So I'm looking to start trying to invest in IT and having some additional IT support. And then our recreation staff, as I mentioned earlier, we had sort of cut that back completely when we talked about the things that we cut during the pandemic. We cut it back completely, and to be fair, the attendance went, to 0 because people weren't comfortable coming and doing that. But we just last month hit the participation levels for the first time of pre-pandemic. So we've returned to the pre-pandemic participation levels. So it's time to start trying to add a key person here or there to support it. The last one is the trolley, which has really been a challenge. We've tried to do several things very creatively, and that one is just tough right now. As you can imagine, especially in Ojai, where we have part-time trolley drivers and a lot are retired and they sort of do it for fun. And being in a enclosed vehicle with 10, 20 other people right now is not something a lot of people are comfortable with, even to this point. And so we had a lot of those drivers who just said, I'm not comfortable driving. And we still have some of those drivers. And then we had some drivers who said, I think it's time to retire. So the impact of that was we used to have 2 routes. We are now operating 1 route. And we did a couple things to try to recruit. We raised the trolley driver pay, and we created a employee retention incentive. And we have not, in those 6 months since we've done those, we've still not been able to hire 1 trolley driver. And we lost another one due to retirement. So we're looking at trying to adjust those to try to keep figuring out how to solve that quandary. And I think, again, a lot of this stuff is across the board. I hear that almost all agencies with transit programs are having the same challenges, but there is just that extra wrinkle of, in other agencies where it's a full-time driver and it's just a normal full-time job, it's they're having a little bit of a different reaction than ours, where it's typically part-time retiree drivers. Next slide, please. So those were those key categories. The last slide was the liabilities and deferred maintenance and staffing. There are a couple other that sort of fall into the other category. Maybe not, actually. I should have looked at this closer. I thought these were other, but they still sort of hit the same categories. The first is that we adopted the policy, and the budget committee recommended that all the cannabis revenue go to reserves until we hit our reserve goal. And so the reason why we talked about reserves earlier is because it impacts whether things like the cannabis revenue will go to reserves or not. And so the proposed budget, assuming that we were going to increase the reserve, the proposed budget does already transfer the cannabis revenue to reserves. So that's built into the budget. Additionally, just calling out that last year, the city council specifically, we had the community funding category for several years. And last year, the council directed staff that moving forward, the museum would be a separate line item in the budget, and that it would be funded at the same level. So this budget includes that funding. It includes the museum for $60,000. But what this budget does not include is any community funding, and we'll talk more about that. What I mean by community funding is the community grant funding. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but that is we started out the budget with the things that we need to do. When we then put that together and we ended up with a $196,000 deficit, my thought at that point is if we can't afford to do the things we need to do, then I can't start off recommending the community grant funding. So that is not included in the budget at this point. And I'm sure that will be a hot topic. The other thing, the budget, if you looked at it, you probably noticed that the litigation and attorney costs are projected to go up this year, and that we had to adjust the proposed budget to show that next year. Nobody likes to spend money on attorneys, myself included, but the reality right now is we have more pending litigation items than we've ever had, and that's not something really that I can control necessarily. But I think we have currently 8 different litigation items. And I would say the first 3 years I was here, we had 0. So the reality is our attorney costs go up. And I might try to make the point when we go to the council meeting that it would be great if we could reduce some of those costs. But for now, based on the trend from this year and how that has gone over budget, we had to adjust the budget to show funding for next year because those litigation items still continue. And then last is the contingency that we've talked about. The first couple years we had a contingency, we had $250,000. We increased it last year to $500,000. This budget includes it at $450,000. And so that is built into this budget. And so all of those expenditures are what go into this budget that result in the $196,000 deficit. It's continuing last year's service level with these additional items. So, James, next slide, please. I don't remember how many there are. This is just more detail on the expenditures and showing that one of the big increases is over the last couple years was the salaries and benefits, but with the reminder and the caveat that it's only because they had dropped during COVID and they're starting to come back up. And you can see pre-COVID they were higher than the next several years. So we're basically this year, right this minute, we're finally back at the pre-COVID level of staffing. And so next year will be the first year that we hope to actually sort of have some the cost of living and then a couple key increases. So Yeah, I have 3 committees today, so my next committee just walked in, I think. The other trend from this is the contract services. You'll notice that that's gone way up. Couple reasons. One was that because we were shorthanded on staff, we would contract things that we used to not contract for. And then the other is just, again, the reality that costs are going up. So when you hire a contractor, almost across the board, even contractors we've had have sent their annual notices that their rates are going to go up. And I think that'll continue in the immediate future. Next slide, please. So the unfunded PERS liability that I think Bob was referring to as well. There's a couple points to make to it. These numbers are always a little bit behind. We're working on updating them, but for PERS liability, our most recent estimate was that we had about $6 million in that liability building up. That translates to the chart below that shows that our annual payments each year are expected to be about $500,000. And I think we haven't gotten a chance to talk, but I think we heard that these are now expected to go up too. Yeah. So, it's very volatile, or I wouldn't say volatile, but every couple of years it seems like their projection kind of jumps again, and then it's higher than what we thought it was going to be. But, so we pay $500,000 a year, and we still have a $6 million liability. So we had talked about prepaying the additional $100,000 that would drop with the goal of paying all our unfunded liability by 2035, 13 years faster than not doing it, which would have been 2048. This budget actually, we are proposing increasing it to $150,000, and then we'll run the numbers for how much additional time that may take off. But the goal is to just keep trying to chip away at that.
Do you have a percentage number from the PERS saying what percentage of your liability, or the estimated liability is?
Uh-huh.
Is it 80%, 90%?
Yeah, let's see if we have that. This is one we were planning to do more of a deep dive on at some point, but
So PERS is about 73%.
73% funded?
Yeah.
So 73% funded.
Okay, so, and what would it take to get it to, say, minimum of 80%?
Minimum of 80%. You're saying like this year or
Well, I'm just
over a
saying
period?
that, to be 73% funding is low.
Yeah.
Ideally, you'd be at 100%, but unfortunately, the way the systems and the actuaries work, if you go to 100%, then you have a fluctuation. When market's good, suddenly you're overfunded and you get demands for more benefits type of pressure.
Yeah.
But, so keeping it around 90% is considered to be very prudent, and we're at 73. So
Yeah.
between whatever 90% would be and 73, then how long would it, and how much a year would it take to bring that current, rather than,
That's something we can look at and come back and see what we'd have to pay to get it to 80. In my prior experience, and partially because every city I was in had bad financial situations, and their goal was to at least get to 80. So I think that's at least a reasonable starting point, is we should be trying to get to 80.
it can fluctuate between 80 and 90, and you're in good shape. If you don't have it at that, then you're going to get hit
Yeah.
at some point.
Yeah.
Somebody's going to get hit.
Exactly. And right now, we're hearing and starting to see that all PERS costs are just going up right now. And I think if there is a recession and the continued impact on the stock market,
They
I think we're going to see it
started sending you
again.
the assumption on earnings.
I think-
It gets to be a big topic.
Yeah, I don't know if we got that this year yet. Yeah. May, yeah. I think we always get it right at the end of the budget, yeah, or the budget cycle. Okay, next slide, James. I'm going to skip this one. It's just a chart version of that last one. And then, so that's sort of what's in the budget. It's the some of the unfunded liabilities. Like I said, we didn't have the streets liability in here because this is general fund, and that is theoretically CIP. But the point is valid that it's millions of dollars. I think the 5-year cycle that we're looking at right now is probably going to be about $15 million to get it to a pavement score of 70, to just get to a passing pavement score, $15 million. And so there's also that huge liability out there. So, it's sort of some good news, but still a lot of bad news. We've started to build up reserves. We've started to staff up, but there's still a lot of things to catch up on. And so,
But the source of funding for your roads is primarily from the general fund, isn't it?
not anymore.
That's good news.
So Measure C now has really changed it. And I think the goal of today was to really kind of figure out the general fund budget. Maybe, kind of thinking through, it's hard to do that in a vacuum, knowing that there's these other liabilities. But so most of this is focused on the general fund, but the next couple slides, so we'll come back to this. Let's just go into the next couple slides right now. Next slide, please, James. So Measure C. And so Measure C doesn't show up in this document anywhere because it's not in the general fund. We've made it a separate fund. And so up until 2020, the reason why we never paved is because you had to find the money in the general fund.
Right.
And we always use the money for something else. There's always some other priority. And so we adopted Measure C in March of 2020. I think we celebrated the 1 week, March 6th, which I think was 1 week to the day before we declared the COVID emergency. And so we knew, okay, we've adopted this. This is great. It's going to start paying for paving. It'll take a year to build up, but we'll start being able to pave. Well, it ended up taking more than a year to build up because the first year the hotels were closed. So in the first year, we collected $50,000. So it wasn't the immediate change that we expected. The second year, the hotels started to reopen. It got to about $1.7 million. So that was more along the lines of what we expected. And then the good news is over 21, 22, and then what we're projecting this year is the hotels have increased their rates so much and their capacity so much, or their occupancy so much, that it's actually exceeding what we estimated. We had estimated we'd get to about $2 million a year average, and we've been closer to, well, we ended last year at almost 3, and then this year we're projecting to be right at 3. And so that's all good news. But with the paving project and potentially with the ATP, that will go very quickly. And so it's good that we have it. It's a source we didn't have before. This right now is the plan is that this is paying for the bulk of paving, but it's going to be pretty tight because when we do that 5-year plan, the rough estimate is that it's going to be $2.5 to $3 million per year for paving. So the good news is we have it, but it's basically all of Measure C at this point. And that's why we had re-implemented the 10% transfer, because basically that 10% transfer would probably cover all the other things that we need to do.
Is ATP associated with this?
So ATP is associated with this based on the conversation on Tuesday at 1 a.m. What time did we get out of there? Midnight? So if anybody didn't catch it, or if anybody fell asleep at that point, so just like paving, the ATP costs are going up, and the most recent estimate showed that the construction budget from 2016, 7 years ago, that the ATP would be $3 million is not adequate anymore. And so
So the state's not covering it like the original deal was.
So we had a discussion at council on Tuesday, and we came to council and let the council know that every project is 30% or higher over budget. This project will be 30% or higher over budget. And so we had the two options of deciding it was time to put the project on hold, or sort of deciding up front that we were going to do it, and that I needed to also then start start adjusting the CIP, postponing other projects, and that sort of thing to be able to
And the
afford the
decision
ATP.
was?
And so the council chose to continue with the ATP.
So they're gonna take the money and put it into ATP and take it away from paving all the substandard streets throughout the city.
So my recommendation to council was prioritize paving above all else and postpone other projects. And so next slide, James. I gave this slide, which showed, for example, the projects we're planning to do next year right now. It shows the original budgeted cost and then recent projections. So the street paving that we had thought would be $1.3 million of Measure C. It's more than 1.3. It's actually $2 million, but it's grants and things like that. So 1.3 million of Measure C is now estimated to cost us 2.3 million of Measure C. So that, again, we talked a minute ago about how we've built up sort of, $6 million in Measure C funding, but that can go very quick. And so paving is expected to go $1 million over budget, and take 2.3 million of that. And then we had other projects. So the discussion at council is, if we aren't going to postpone paving, but pretty much everything on this list, everything else on this list is going to have to be put on hold, postponed a year or two if we want to do the ATP. And the council chose to do that. So, yeah, so we're going to come back and, these are the projects that I gave as examples at the meeting. The Libby bathrooms will be postponed a couple years. The Boyd Center roof will be postponed a couple years, the sports courts, and then the Public Works microgrid. And again, I know this chart might be a little confusing, but it's the original budgeted costs and then what those look like now. So, so I think, long story short, is that we have the money to do paving and ATP. We don't have the money to do everything else then. So,
Can I jump in here for a second? So just for background, Johnny, I had an amendment to direct staff to ask the budget committee, that's what I said, right, James, to focus, to look for ways we could reduce so that we could have our reserves for a year, ideally. Do the road paving, make sure we retain and compensate employees, and then, of course, climate change, which, so we're going to do a little magic.
Okay, well, city facility repairs, that sounds, and a roof on the Boyd Center.
the facility repairs is Kent Hall.
What?
Kent Hall. The Kent Hall next door. So we took Kent Hall back and it was in disrepair from the prior tenant.
Right,
So-
okay. Is that like rehab or rehabilitation, or is it also like patching the roof?
There's both. So we've done some work. Anybody who's been to Kent Hall recently can probably tell you walk through and half of the building looks pretty nice and the other half looks terrible.
Yeah.
And we repaired half that we were going to use, and then we started to repair the roof. But the budget was supposed to be next year we'd repair the other half of the building. So that's going to be on hold, and it means that we won't be able to use half the building for another year. So, but these are the difficult decisions at this point of, we can't.
It seems like there's a mix of things there. What is this, sports courts? Is that thing they've talked about forever in the
Yeah.
back next to the residential properties? That
Yes.
are gonna have all the citizens upset with the noise?
Exactly.
Okay,
And-
well, that, if that doesn't happen, isn't gonna, increase your cost later, or at least not on anything that's critical, but
Yeah.
to have things like roof repair that doesn't get taken in a timely way is gonna cost a hell of a lot more.
Yeah. Well, that'd be, so, some of the feedback from this committee that would be helpful. So essentially what we had said at the meeting on Tuesday is we just wanted everybody to realize that we can't do all of it. We don't have the funding to do all of it. We
Right,
can't do
yeah.
paving, we can't do ATP, we can't do all the dream projects. So I think what I'm sort of hearing, and maybe the feedback from the committee that we can then use to prepare this, is not to defer the deferred maintenance items, but defer the, I don't want to say luxuries, but
but
the ones that aren't costing us money. It's just not a new thing. And so, for example, the Libby Park bathrooms, I really like the project. I like the idea, but our current bathrooms are fine. It was just going to be
We can get by.
a redesign. The redesign was basically to add a couple more stalls, you know, but we can get by without that for a couple years. The currently sort of how that's dealt with is that when there's a big event, it's only a problem when we have big events. When there's a big event, people bring in porta potties. So it would be another year or two that we'd have to do that. So
I would assume that in those numbers for facilities repair for Boyd Center roof might have a subset that doesn't have to all be done.
Yeah.
But at least the portions of it that are only going to drive the price up and damage the property, I would hope the council would reconsider that.
yeah.
And certainly not be considering giving money to community groups. You know, one thing that this town has gotten in I think, a bad habit. I mean, it's a nice to do, but it's a bad habit. They pick winners and losers amongst private, nonprofit groups mostly, and never get a report on a result, and yet they spend anywhere from $150,000 to $300,000 probably a year. And there's no obligation under the state law to do any of that stuff. And these things, just the laws of nature require us to be doing something.
Yeah, well, that's really the takeaway this year is that, and that was the point with council, is if we're going to do the ATP, it means that a lot of the stuff we like to do but don't have to do isn't going to happen this year and probably the following year. I did tell the council I think it'll be
That
2 full
ATP
years.
thing's been going on for, what, 7 years? And the original deal was it wasn't going to cost the city a dime other than to staff coordination. And then we knew we lost it because the former public works director didn't get the reimbursement on the upfront cost of maybe $250,000. And then we cut it back to where it was only one of 3 phases. And now we're going to do 1 phase, and the council's going to, man. I mean, I understand where the pressures come from, but boy, you talk about a tough priority because that may still not do it. There's nothing to
I'm
guarantee
finishing
you
one.
that it won't be another 2 or 3 years and another increase.
Yeah.
And,
Meanwhile, the roofs leak or whatever.
and as you explained it the other night, it's at this point sort of an all or nothing thing. right?
Yeah.
I mean, we
yes.
can't
Every
just
grant-
do part
I
of
explained
it.
this
Yeah.
in depth to the council, but every grant, one of the problems with the project is that every grant was applied for the whole project. Instead of what I would have done is applied for each part as a different grant, and then you could choose which ones you want.
You say
And-
all or nothing for the 3 phases?
Yeah, so every grant had the full project with all of the elements listed. And so we've already talked to those agencies of like, if we wanted to just tear this part out or, pull this part out and keep this part, and they will not, they're not willing to put in writing that they wouldn't demand the money back if we didn't do the whole project. So I had told the council the decision really needs to be, are you willing to do the whole thing or not? And if not, now's the time to get out. So that was the discussion we had on Tuesday.
If I understood what he just said, the city's buying a pig in a poke because there's no way for them to know what the future costs will be. So it's going to be good money after what? I won't say bad necessarily, but are you talking, when I say the 3 phases, are you talking about the downtown area that'll be hugely controversial when you eliminate what little parking is left in the downtown and then all the way out to Gridley Road?
So phase 1, Maricopa Highway. I don't think there's a part of this that isn't controversial. Phase
I
1,
know.
Maricopa Highway. Phase 2, Ojai Avenue. Now, the one thing is, at one point, what you're remembering is at one point, the Ojai Avenue portion had the parking removed downtown. That we were able to undo. So the parking wouldn't be removed. I'm not saying it won't be controversial though, because what it will be is
We'll be riding bicycles
yes.
down there?
So it's Sharrow bike lanes where bikes will be riding on the street, and that will be controversial. We get you get complaints whenever you put those in.
Yeah, I know. It just seems like, wow, what a decision you're making.
That was a tough one.
Oh, a tough one, an expensive one, hugely expensive.
Yeah. But we had that discussion on Tuesday because it guides this conversation. Again, because we can't do everything, it was, are we sure?
Well, I understand that. I'm not picking on the staff. I'm just, looking at the mayor and saying, wow, I don't know if the
Yeah, it's
council
a-
fully appreciates what they're talking about doing.
So, so Measure C, I guess the nutshell is, it gives us enough money to pave. And then it looks like if it projects if it goes the way we're projecting, it's enough money to do the ATP using some city funds that weren't originally proposed. But then other stuff's going to get put on hold. But that is why, maybe I should have started with this, is that's why we did recommend the $600,000 transfer from the general fund to the CIP, because that will help be able to do some of the things we still need to do, like you mentioned a moment ago, like prioritizing deferred maintenance items that have been deferred for a long time. So next slide, I don't remember. Okay. Can you go back about 3 or 4? There, yeah, that one. So that's the proposed budget. That's the proposed sort of process we're taking. At this point, maybe should we take a break?
What, do you have a calendar on steps of what you're gonna, your targets for dates? Because I think we've gone for,
Yeah, 2 hours, and I'm already in my second and third committee.
You have another meeting in a week or so to really,
Yeah, so let's do this. Let's go ahead and, my suggestion at this point is let's set another date for a follow-up just on these topics, and everybody can absorb and come back. I think it's a lot to absorb, so. And it's not. So the next item on our budget calendar was to go to council on April 11th, but I don't think that's not going to happen at this point. I don't think so. So I would say if we have a budget committee meeting that week,
I can meet next week, most any time.
how about? Oh, I've got 2 calendars I have to check. Give me a second.
Well, I want to thank the staff for, a good presentation to get the conversation started. Unfortunately, it's a very complicated thing to deal with. I think the budget is you presented is reasonable, but there potentially are unintended consequences that the council should be aware of.
Yeah. How about April 13th?
You what?
How about April 13th? Is everybody
That's
available?
what, 2 weeks?
Yeah, 2 weeks from today. Gives everybody time to think about it, and if anybody wants to ask questions in the meantime, we can respond to those. But on the 13th at 9 a.m.? Okay. So we've decided with being 2.5 hours into the meeting that we'll absorb and come back, I think, is the idea.
Okay. Well, yeah, I can do it on the 13th, but I could do it earlier next week, and that's too much of a burden on the staff to.
Unfortunately, I have more committees than I can handle.
Yeah, okay, I
And
understand.
They're in the room next door already, so,
You're the chief cook and bottle washer.
so
Jack of all trades.
I think that'll work. So,
Okay.
so.
What time,
and then,
9
I think-
o'clock?
I was thinking 9 a.m.
Yeah, it's fine with me.
Does that work? Steve, do you have, did you say you have a public comment?
Thank you, sir. And I just wanted to say something in defense of my position as an OVSD director. I just texted with the general manager of the district, and he said they have not hired anyone from City of Ojai staff anytime recently. I thought that was probably the case with the possible exception of administrative staff, like a receptionist or something. But all of the operational staff at OVSD has to have certifications that nobody in the city of Ojai would have any reason to have. So
Yeah, we've had 2 go to Casitas and then 1 somewhere else. I don't know if it was sanitary or.
I
or-
suspect it was the Ventura River Water
Yeah,
District.
possibly, yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Or the school district, or the such, it's not, no criticism of those districts.
Yeah.
They gotta do what they gotta do, but we need to be paying at least a competitive wage.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, for us, there's so many unique things in Ojai that you get someone who understands it all and is well-trained, and then they get taken away and then you start over, so. All right, so I think with that, so we can come back in 2 weeks. Like I said, if anybody has any questions or anything, feel free to send them, and we'll come back and we'll probably go through sort of the key questions and then any questions that anybody else has at that point to start sort of whittling down. Because at the end of it, right now we do have a deficit of $196,000, and there's a few areas that we can look at to address that. And so we'll need to have that discussion of how we close the gap and if there's any other changes.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you guys, you and Pam, for the hard work. I know
Yeah.
this is not an easy task.
Thank you, and thanks for.
Not only do you have to do it, then it's like painting a big target on you, because everybody's gonna say, well, why isn't my thing in there? Or like
Yeah.
I'm saying, why is the council doing that? Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of people feel like, it's improving and getting better, so we must be flush, but the answer is that we have to catch up on all the stuff we put off, so.
Yeah,
All right.
the 3-year hiatus
Thank you.
doesn't help, does it?
Yeah, I know. That is basically it.